DC's multiverse wasn't a carefully designed feature. It was an accident that spiraled out of control for 50 years, creating a maze of parallel Earths where every character had 3 versions and nobody could agree on what was real anymore. By 1985, DC had Earth 1 with the Justice League, Earth 2 with the Golden Age Justice Society, Earth 3 where everyone was evil, plus a dozen others absorbed from companies they'd bought and forgotten about. New readers couldn't get in, old readers couldn't keep up, and DC decided the only solution was to burn it all down. Crisis on Infinite Earths. Crisis on Infinite Earths ran for 12 issues from 1985 to 1986, written by Marv Wolfman and penciled by George Perez, and it threw nearly every major DC character against the Anti-Monitor, a cosmic destroyer using antimatter waves to annihilate parallel realities one by one. DC used that diegetic destruction as cover for editorial house cleaning, and unlike most comics events, it had real consequences. Barry Allen's Flash died saving the multiverse and stayed dead in main continuity for over 20 years. Supergirl died in battle. Comics don't do permanence, but Crisis put its money where its mouth was. The series compressed DC's infinite multiverse into one unified Earth with one linear history. Writers immediately relaunched core franchises around the new template. John Byrne relaunched Superman. George Perez relaunched Wonder Woman from scratch. The promise was clarity, but the irony is built in. Reconciling 50 years of stories in one editorial stroke always leaves fragments. Power Girl immediately required a convoluted new backstory just to exist in a single Earth reality. New inconsistencies arose almost immediately as creative teams retrofitted characters into a template that didn't quite fit. The cleanup created its own mess, which is, not ideal. But if you think one universe-shattering reboot was enough, wait until you hear about the soft reboot DC launched less than a decade later to fix the problems the first one created. 0 Hour, Crisis in Time. Less than a decade after Crisis on Infinite Earths promised to clean up DC's continuity mess, the company was already back at it. Turns out, one unified Earth didn't magically solve everything. Rotating creative teams kept interpreting the new timeline in wildly different ways, and by 1994, DC had accumulated enough fresh contradictions to need another patch job. That patch job was 0 Hour, Crisis in Time, and if Crisis was the ambitious fix, 0 Hour was the admission that the fix didn't work. The threat this time was temporal. Writer-artist Dan Jurgens centered the event on Parallax, a corrupted version of Hal Jordan who'd turned villain after his home city of Coast City was destroyed. Parallax wanted to obliterate reality and rebuild it correctly, which makes him a literalized editorial impulse given godlike powers and a grudge. A second villain, Extant, exploited the collapsing time stream for his own reality-reshaping ambitions, and as everything fell apart, heroes from different eras started encountering earlier and later versions of themselves. The core miniseries counted backwards from issue 4 to 0, with the 0 issue presenting a new present-day status quo. It wasn't just a narrative device. It was DC saying, here are clean origin restatements. Here are accessible jumping-on points. Please ignore the last 9 years of confusion. The event culminated in an entirely new Big Bang, but the single Earth model stayed intact. The specific targets were Hawkman and Legion of Superheroes, 2 continuities that had never fully recovered from Crisis. Here's the kicker. Even after 0 Hour, both remained contentious. The event didn't fix what it promised to fix, which earned it the fan nickname, The Forgotten Crisis. It proved that the unified timeline required constant maintenance, and that every attempt to simplify would eventually collapse under its own weight. 0 Hour was DC admitting Crisis hadn't worked, but also proof that no single event ever could. The cracks were already forming, and they'd only get worse when Infinite Crisis rolled around a decade later. Infinite Crisis. By the mid-2000s, DC had been running on a single unified timeline for 20 years, and the cracks were showing. Infinite Crisis, published from 2005 to 2006 as a 7-issue series written by Jeff Johns, was simultaneously a sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths, and a metafictional critique of everything DC had done since 1986. The villains aren't cosmic threats. They're leftover characters from the original Crisis, including Superman of Earth 2, Alexander Luthor, and Superboy Prime, who have been sitting in limbo outside reality, watching the post-Crisis world grow dark and morally compromised, and deciding it's fundamentally broken. Here's the thing. These antagonists are basically stand-ins for angry DC readers. Superboy Prime in particular becomes a memeable personification of the entitled fanboy who thinks he knows how the universe should be, throwing tantrums about how everything was better before. Alexander Luthor builds a reality-altering tower from the Anti-Monitor's remains, briefly flashing glimpses of pre-crisis worlds. For readers who missed the old multiverse, it was nostalgic bait, wrapped in a narrative acknowledgement that the single-Earth experiment had real limitations. But the Earth 2 Superman is where it gets genuinely tragic. He represents a simpler, more optimistic era, the Golden Age hero who fought Nazis and stood for unambiguous good, and watching the modern DC universe grow cynical and brutal breaks him. He looks at a world where heroes mind-wipe villains, where cities get nuked, and sees a failed timeline. He's not wrong, exactly. Infinite Crisis weaponizes that observation and makes the text explicitly interrogate whether the original crisis was worth it. The stakes aren't abstract. Over 5 million people died during the event, and iconic locations like Bloodhaven are permanently destroyed. The resolution creates exactly 52 parallel Earths, a managed multiverse compared to the pre-1985 free-for-all, while the 1 year later initiative jumped every DC title forward 12 months, letting the publisher quietly adjust continuity without showing the work. Fan response split hard. Many praised the self-awareness. Others saw the 52-world multiverse as an admission that a single unified timeline had definitively failed. But if you think watching DC wrestle with its own continuity baggage is complicated, wait until you see what happens when the Flash decides to save his mom. Flashpoint. The entire DC multiverse nearly collapsed because a man wanted to save his mom. By 2011, DC was facing a triple threat: dense continuity scaring off new readers, a brutal competitive market, and digital distribution reshaping everything. They needed a hard reset. Flashpoint, written by Jeff Johns with art by Andy Kubert, became the pivot point for the most dramatic line-wide reboot since 1985. The premise is deceptively simple. Barry Allen travels back in time to stop his mother Nora's murder. That's it. One emotional, personal act. But the ripple effects are catastrophic. He wakes up in a world where Thomas Wayne is Batman because Bruce died instead. Superman is a malnourished government prisoner who's never seen sunlight, and Atlanteans and Amazons are destroying Europe in a war that's already killed millions. Barry has no powers. He has to recreate himself as the Flash from scratch, which grounds the high-concept alternate reality before the full scale of the horror becomes clear. Here's the thing. This isn't a branching timeline. It's the timeline, rewritten from the ground up. Every hero Barry knows is dead, corrupted, or unrecognizable, and Barry realizes too late that his one selfish act of kindness destroyed everything. The resolution is brutal. Barry has to allow his mother's death. He has to stand there and let her die, knowing he could stop it. But when he fixes the paradox, the reset doesn't simply restore the original timeline. It merges the main DC line, the Vertigo imprint, and the Wildstorm universe into a single new hybrid continuity. A character named Pandora literally manipulates events to force the merger. Barry thinks he's restoring what was lost. He's actually building something completely different. At the conclusion of Flashpoint, DC canceled every ongoing title, every single one. In September 2011, they launched 52 brand new series starting from issue number 1. Action Comics, running since 1938, started over. Detective Comics, same thing. The boldest publishing move in decades, all hinging on a story about a man who couldn't let his mother die. Debate still persists about whether Flashpoint was always designed as a reboot engine, or whether the scope expanded mid-development. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, which is fitting for a story about timelines collapsing into each other. If you think one man's grief reshaping reality is dramatic, wait until you see what DC did with that blank slate. The New 52. In September 2011, DC Comics did something genuinely insane. They canceled their entire existing line and simultaneously launched 52 new monthly series, every single one starting at issue number 1. Action Comics, running continuously since 1938, was reset. Detective Comics, which literally gave the company its name, was reset. Sales spiked. People who hadn't touched a comic in years walked into stores. DC had everyone's attention. But here's where it gets complicated. The New 52 wasn't a full reboot. It was a selective reboot, and that's where the problem started. The new continuity compressed all superhero activity into a 5-year timeline. Characters were younger, redesigned with armored contemporary aesthetics. Superman lost his red trunks, which sounds superficial until you realize those trunks had been part of his design for 73 years. DC wanted modern, edgy, streamlined, except they only wanted that for some characters. Batman's entire history was preserved and somehow crammed into that 5-year window. Green Lantern's continuity carried over intact because it was selling well. So, while Superman's marriage to Lois Lane was erased and the Teen Titans were radically reimagined, Batman got to keep his toys. The logic was pure commerce dressed up as narrative necessity, and readers noticed immediately. Then there's Wally West, the legacy Flash. Not dead, not retired, just erased from existence. Fans were furious, because Wally represented everything the New 52 seemed allergic to. The idea that legacies matter, that history has weight. DC torched one of the most successful examples of legacy heroism in comics history in the name of a fresher universe. The timeline itself was the final problem. 5 years. In those 5 years, the Justice League supposedly formed, fought Darkseid multiple times, and navigated events that previously took decades to unfold. Comic book time is always elastic, but this was compression past the point of absurdity. Readers kept asking how any of this was supposed to have happened. DC never had a satisfying answer. The New 52 promised clarity and delivered confusion. Despite strong initial sales, the cracks showed fast. Within 2 years, titles were being canceled, editorial mandates were clashing with creators, and the fan base was fracturing into camps. Those who embraced the fresh start and those who mourned what was lost. If you think erasing a Flash and compressing 70 years of history into 5 is bad, wait until you see how DC tried to fix it by bringing everything back. DC Rebirth. In May 2016, DC launched an 80-page one-shot that did something no previous reboot had dared. It looked back at the New 52 and said, out loud, we messed up. DC Universe Rebirth Special Number 1 wasn't another hard reset. It was a restoration project, a deliberate acknowledgement that the New 52 had stripped out the legacy, relationships, and emotional history that defined DC's identity. And the entire special is built around one character who embodies that loss, Wally West. Wally is trapped in the Speed Force, reaching out to everyone he loves, and none of them remember him. Not Barry, not Iris, not Linda. He's watching his own life get erased in real time, and when Barry finally remembers and pulls him back into reality, it's not just a reunion, it's a metaphor. DC reclaiming its own forgotten past. For fans who felt like their history had been wiped in 2011, that hit hard. But here's where it gets complicated. The special doesn't just promise to restore the old stuff, it posits a conspiracy. Approximately 10 years have been deliberately stolen from the DC universe. Relationships compressed, legacies erased, histories shortened. And then it drops the reveal. The blood-stained smiley face button from Watchmen is embedded in the Batcave wall, crackling with energy. The implication is immediate and absurd and brilliant. Dr. Manhattan, a near-omnipotent being from a separate universe, rewrote DC continuity. The New 52 was sabotage, a cosmic experiment by a character literally associated with cynicism and deconstruction. The later miniseries Doomsday Clock confirmed it explicitly, making Watchmen canonically part of DC's main timeline and recontextualizing years of comics as deliberate in-story vandalism. Instead of quietly retconning the New 52, Rebirth made it a crime scene. That's one of the most audacious narrative moves in modern comics history. As a publishing initiative, Rebirth restored the pre-Flashpoint Superman, brought back the Lois Lane marriage, reintegrated the Justice Society, and returned legacy characters like Wally to the line. The philosophy was restoration over replacement. Everything lost could come back, because it had been stolen, not erased. Fan reception was significantly warmer than the New 52 had generated, but the Watchmen integration stayed controversial. For some, inspired metafiction. For others, a violation of a self-contained classic. Either way, Rebirth marked a turning point. The first reboot that argued the previous reboot was a crime committed against the universe itself. But if you think Stolen Time was the endpoint, Infinite Frontier was about to blow that idea wide open. Infinite Frontier. For 40 years, DC spent most of its energy trying to simplify its own history. Crisis on Infinite Earths collapsed an infinite multiverse into one Earth. Zero Hour tried to smooth out the wrinkles. Infinite Crisis capped the multiverse at exactly 52 worlds. Every solution created new problems. Every fix required another fix, and the pattern repeated until 2021, when DC finally tried something different. Infinite Frontier said, stop fighting it. Everything happened. Every continuity, every era, every contradictory version of every character exists somewhere in an unbounded omniverse. And that's not a bug, it's the entire point. The shift is philosophical as much as structural. Rather than capping the multiverse at a specific number of Earths, Infinite Frontier removes the numerical limit entirely, positing creating an omniverse of infinite realities that includes pre-crisis Earths, Elseworlds, brand new timelines, and anything else writers want to pull from. For longtime readers, it's permission to stop worrying about what counts. For someone picking up their first comic, it's walking into a library with no catalog. The initiative followed Dark Knights, Death Metal, which had already introduced the Omniverse concept, positioning Infinite Frontier as a culmination of decades of oscillation between single-universe and multiverse models, rather than yet another reset. It's not erasing what came before, it's validating all of it at once. Writer Joshua Williamson's miniseries focuses on figures like Alan Scott, the original Golden Age Green Lantern, and President Superman of Earth-23, characters who embody DC's interconnected realities. The story treats continuity as terrain to explore rather than a problem to correct, which is a radical reframe after 40 years of treating it as an obstacle. Longtime readers broadly praised the openness and the willingness to draw from multiple eras simultaneously without forcing a choice between pre-crisis, New 52, or rebirth continuities, and acknowledge that someone else's cake exists in a parallel dimension, and both are equally valid. But newer readers found the everything counts somewhere model genuinely daunting, because if everything counts, where do you start? DC hasn't fully resolved that tension. Infinite Frontier's deepest significance is that it reconceptualizes reboots entirely. Crisis on Infinite Earths compressed infinity into one Earth. Infinite Frontier expands one Earth back into infinity. After decades of trying to clean up the mess, DC finally made peace with the fact that the mess was always the most interesting part. The challenge now is figuring out how to tell stories that matter when every possible story already exists somewhere in the Omniverse. But at least DC finally stopped fighting itself, which is more than you can say for the next initiative, where the company tried to turn all that omniversal openness into something resembling a coherent publishing strategy. Dawn of DC. And that brings us to the present. As of January 2023, DC launched what it called Dawn of DC. And here's what's different about this one. It didn't reboot anything. Not a single issue went back to the one that didn't want to. The initiative officially kicked off with Action Comics' The Year 151, which, if you're keeping track, means DC's flagship Superman title just kept counting. No reset, no clean slate, just the next issue in a run that stretches back over 80 years. Dawn of DC isn't a reboot. It's not even a relaunch in the traditional sense. Think of it like a TV show that got renewed. Same universe, same characters, new storylines, fresh creative teams. The initiative rolled out over 20 titles across 2023, spotlighting everyone from Hal Jordan and Jon Stewart in Green Lantern to Shazam, the Doom Patrol, Green Arrow, and even the Penguin. Each book was designed as a jumping-on point, not because continuity got erased, but because the stories themselves were built to welcome you in. The whole thing builds directly on two major 2022 crossovers, Dark Crisis on Infinite Earths and Lazarus Planet. Dark Crisis revisited the original 1985 Crisis and treated the destruction and reconstruction of the multiverse as lived history. Lazarus Planet unleashed magical storms that physically altered metahuman powers across the globe. These weren't events DC wanted you to forget. They were recent consequences that shaped everything that came next. The entire premise of Dawn of DC is that the universe just went through hell, and now everyone's picking up the pieces. For the first time in decades, the dominant fan conversation isn't what counts and what doesn't. It's not endless forum threads debating whether some obscure 1987 issue is still canon. The fandom has absorbed the omniversal model and moved on to evaluating titles on tone, characterization, and whether the story is actually worth reading. That shift is enormous. In the full arc of DC's reboot history, Dawn of DC marks the distance traveled. 40 years ago, Crisis on Infinite Earths destroyed the multiverse because DC wanted one Earth, one timeline, one coherent history. Then it didn't work, so they tried again. Zero Hour, Infinite Crisis, Flashpoint, The New 52, Rebirth, Infinite Frontier. And now, with Dawn of DC, universe-ending catastrophes are just the weather. They're inflection points that reshape stories without erasing them. DC went from destroying its multiverse to living inside it. Every version of DC history has a home now. It's all there, layered and accessible, in a cosmology that no longer pretends it can be reduced to one true version. That's where we are, not at the end of reboots, but at the end of reboots as erasure. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.